Okay, so we talked about the amount of slaves that went to South America and the Caribbean. As you can see in this chart, in this map, a lot of them went to Brazil, actually, especially in Bahia, Brazil. But for the sake of the history of salsa, we're going to look at Cuba in particular. So, as we discussed, the Yoruba was a large ethnic group in the western part of Africa, and a lot of them went to Cuba. Now, there's always going to be little sects and denominations here and there that went into Cuba as well, but we're gonna stick with the Yoruba tribe. So it was estimated that about 600,000 slaves were shipped to Cuba over the period of 1600, 1700, 1800. And the first slaves arrived in 1520 to Havana. But the majority of slaves actually got to Cuba in the later 1700s and actually a handful in the early mid 1800s. All right, so when the slaves were in Cuba, their main focus was to work the sugar and tobacco fields, and in particular, sugar was the main export of Cuba. By 1850, four-fifths of all exports in Cuba was from sugar. And interesting fact, by 1860, one-third of the world's sugar came from Cuba. Now, a couple facts about the timeline of slavery. In 1807, United States and Britain ended and banned the slave trade from Africa. However, the Spanish did not. So the Spanish conquistadors continued on transporting African slaves to Cuba. In 1865, the slave trade officially ended in Cuba. In 1886, slavery in general was abolished in Cuba, and Cuba gained its independence from Spain in 1898. So, of course, during the years of slavery, there was a lot of oppression of the African slaves' cultures and traditions. And of course, the Spanish conquistadors were leading that charge to what they called resist blackening. And they even brought in a lot more European immigrants in order to have more white people on the island. So they established a lot of decrees and ways to oppress the black people, such as decrees on drumming and other African traditions, Santeria and their religions, which we'll get into in a minute, but they oppressed that a lot. However, when slavery was abolished in the later 1800s, Afro-Cuban culture reemerged. And so a lot of these traditions that they brought from their Yoruba background and, from Africa is what we call Afro-Cuban culture. So we're going to transition and focus on their belief systems, which has really influenced Afro-Cuban dance and music and eventually salsa. So if you're going to get anything out of this, it's going to be the breakdown of the orishas or Santeria. There's going to be a lot of different denominations and breakoffs of the religions and pantheons, which is a belief system with many deities or gods. But we're going to focus on orishas slash Santeria. All right, and they're kind of both one and the same. There's a couple differences here and there, but stick with me. We're going to break it down.